And next, I'm going to talk about amplification attacks. So yeah, giant robots are cool. So, because many protocols provide unauthenticated functionality to unknown parties, and many of these protocols use a connectionless transport, it makes it quite trivial to spoof the source address of your packets as your victim and have multiple devices that are receiving those packets respond directly to them. Invoking functionality that responds with a much is your basic amplification attack. And you'd think we would have learned from the Smurf attacks, and apparently not, because just recently there were some attacks that I had actually in my talk specifically for Asterisk, but have recently been patched already, so go open source there. So some tools, pretty much any packeting tool can do this. You can build your own for more specific protocols, or you can modify things like Scapy, add your own protocols there. But there's a few ways to prevent against this. First of all, if the protocol supports multiple transports, use a connection-oriented one. That way, it's a little more difficult to do. Also, authenticate as many protocol messages as possible. A lot of these protocols may authenticate you at the beginning, and they don't after that. The individual packets coming in are not all authenticated. And finally, you can rate limit your network traffic at points of control, kind of like I mentioned earlier. So my next one is called forced call teardown.
I've been trying to call you all day. The flight's been canceled.
Byron, there's Martians everywhere.
Hello?
Byron! Byron!
Yeah, so the worst time to have your call torn down is when there's Martians attacking. It's not a good time to have the phone go out. So, the vulnerability here is that most VoIP protocols are unencrypted on the wire and don't authenticate all of the messages, like I said a second ago. Because of this, the signaling channel can be monitored and call state can be tracked. In order to attack this, you inject your spoofed call teardown message into the signaling channel, and it tears down the call in progress. Some effective messages for SIP are buy. There's a message actually called buy, which tears down the call. Skinny has one called reset, and IAX has one called hang up. Basically, when this attack is successful, the target endpoint of the call thinks that the remote device has sent it the message to terminate the call, so it goes ahead and does so, and it essentially ends the call prematurely. There's a couple of different tools that can perform this attack. Teardown is a SIP buy message injector. SIP kill is also a SIP buy message injector, but it also supports injecting other types of SIP messages that will do essentially the same thing. And SIP proxy kill is basically a modified version of SIP kill, but it's to target specifically proxies. So some ways to prevent against this are obviously encrypting your signaling channel. And also, if you're not encrypting your signaling channel, authenticate all your signaling messages again. If it's related to an established call, you really should authenticate every message. So the next section is basically attacks against integrity. The first one kind of a more generalized version of the one I just talked about, which is signaling manipulation. The forced call teardown was basically the same thing, but there's a lot of other things you can do with manipulating the signaling. There we go. So that one's kind of hard to catch, but the Martian in the middle was walking a severed hand across the table by manipulating its electrical signals. All right, so signaling manipulation is a pretty large area of attacks. There's, like I said, there's a ton of things that you can do by manipulating various signaling. The vulnerabilities here are, again, VoIP signaling protocols are unencrypted on the wire, and you can have unauthenticated functionality. So, unlike traditional telephony, most signaling extends all the way to the endpoint device. This provides great attractive input vector for attacking. To perform signaling manipulation, you can do things like inject malicious signaling messages into an existing signaling channel between devices. You can also send new signaling message that are completely unrelated to call to endpoint devices or servers, things like that. You can forcibly tear down call like we saw earlier. That attack was, like I said, really both an availability attack and an integrity attack. And you can also do things like cause the media channel to be redirected, duplicated, and sent to a third party, completely torn down. You can do all kinds of things with this. So this funny little diagram here is my attempt at diagrams for the conference. And this is commonly called the VoIP trapezoid. You'll hear that a lot if you start getting into VoIP. Basically, you've got essentially up at the top your call servers. The little phones there are the endpoint devices. They might not actually be phones. They could be an application running on your computer. But basically, the endpoint devices perform signaling with the servers up at the top. I'm going to use SIP as an example, so those are proxies up at the top. SIP uses a message called invite to initiate a session. So it, whichever one's initiating, sends the invite up to its server. It looks up, figures out where to route the call, sends it over to that entity's call server, which then figures out, okay, this user, where is his phone? Where do I need to route this call? And routes it down to that phone. So for the simplicity, I'm going to assume that the two endpoint devices can route to each other directly. There's a lot of issues with NAT traversal and things like that. If you've got two endpoints that can't actually talk to each other directly for the media, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to assume they can. So you introduce the attacker, and what he does is sends signaling messages spoofed as the call servers to both endpoint devices, which requests them to redirect their RTP streams. With SIP, this is called a redirect. It's basically sending a new invite message that's associated with an existing call. So if this was done, completely outside of an existing call, it's how you initiate it. Once the call is established, you use the same message to basically renegotiate parameters like endpoint device addresses. If you want to change media codecs in the middle of a call, if you want to change the quality of service, things like that. So the attacker re-invites both endpoints and basically requests that both of them change the remote host address for the call to the attacker. So basically then the endpoints reestablish the media channels through the attacker, and he's essentially now an active man in the middle. And since VoIP people like to call their diagrams funny little names, I decided to call this the VoIP Pentagon of Power. So, all right, so some tools that are available to do this. There's one called SIP Redirect RTP, and another cool tool called RTP Proxy. You kind of use those together to do exactly the example that I just showed. SIP Redirect RTP will manipulate the signaling and tell the devices to send the media channel to the attacker, and then use RTP Proxy to proxy that data through, so that as far as nothing's happened. They're still receiving the media, the call's still progressing, everything's cool. So there's other things you can do with signaling manipulation. I mentioned sending new signaling to devices. One thing you can do with registration servers, which is, like I said in the VoIP Basics section, what translates a user to an endpoint device. The device will register with that server and say, okay, I'm over here at this address. you can change that registration. You can delete the registration, add new registrations, and basically do things like hijack media, hijack entire calls, things like that through the registration server. And there's some tools to do that with right there. So some ways to protect against this is, obviously, again, you can encrypt your signaling channel. Also, the protocols should probably be fixed so that they authenticate all of the signaling messages. And like I said earlier, if signaling is part of an existing call and you already know the parties that are involved, you should authenticate those messages against those parties. Encrypting the signaling channel makes it much more difficult to monitor the current status of the call also, in which case you might not know what the call server addresses are, things like that. If you're in the signaling in transit, almost all of this information is right there in the clear for you to read and then do with whatever you may. If protocols remain unencrypted, they should at the very least perform some form of authentication against the messages. I can't say it enough. That's pretty much it for signaling manipulation. That's just kind of the tip of the iceberg for that one. There is so much more you can do with that, but it would take up hours and hours. So I'm going to go on to caller ID spoofing. And this one's also been talked about.
Don't run. We are your friends.
That's my favorite part of that movie. And luckily I found a way to use it. Alright, so caller ID spoofing. Probably right after eavesdropping the media channel, probably the most well-known VoIP attack. The vulnerabilities that allow you to do this are that most VoIP protocols are unauthorized and unverified end-to-end. Endpoint supplied data is not usually challenged in any way. Many automated systems also use caller ID information to authenticate users. So, you might be thinking that I'm oversimplifying, but I'm not. It's really easy to do this, and there's all sorts of things you can do with this. Also, there's many multiple outcomes you can achieve. First, you can obviously appear to the called party as someone you're not. You can use that, with phishing attacks, social engineering, all of that type of social aspects. You can also gain access control or gain access to automated systems like voicemail services, credit card activation systems. They usually authenticate you this way. You can, in some parts of the country, you can even pay your utility bills using your caller ID information to authenticate you. In some part, something to keep in mind on the legality of this attack is right now it's not illegal in the US to spoof your caller ID. If you use that to access a computer system, obviously that's illegal. But in June, the U.S. House of Representatives approved a bill that would actually make it a crime to maliciously falsify your caller ID as it would be seen by the recipient of a call. So if that goes through, basically falsifying your information like this and then calling someone, a crime.